The fall before the rise, hook, and setup. The planet Theron had always been considered a harsh place, even by human standards. Towering mountains, scorching deserts, and violent storms shaped the land. Earth was also known as a death world, but Theron was even more extreme. Many believed that only the bravest or the most desperate would dare to settle there. Yet, humans had proven again and again that they could survive anywhere. They called themselves Deathworlders because their home planet, Earth, was no gentle cradle. But to thrive on Theron, they had pushed their bodies and minds to new limits. Captain Rhea Carter stood at the top of a broken watchtower. Her dark hair caught the wind, and her eyes scanned the horizon. The settlement below lay in ruins. Smoke rose from collapsed buildings, and the streets were empty, except for a few survivors trying to help the wounded. Rhea felt a heaviness in her chest. She remembered how just a day ago, children played in the main square, and market stalls burst with local fruits. Now, everything was dust and rubble. This destruction had not been caused by any natural force. Theron's storms were fierce, but they came and went in patterns the colonists understood. They knew how to wait out the sandstorms and rebuild whatever was damaged. This time, the chaos had come from above. Aliens with sleek ships and cold, pitiless eyes had descended from the sky without warning. They called themselves the Lothraki, known throughout the galaxy as conquerors. Until now, they had ignored the Deathworlders on Theron. But something had changed. The Lothraki had decided to strike. Rhea wondered why the Lothraki attacked so suddenly. Perhaps they wanted Theron's rich minerals, or simply wished to remove any threat. Whatever their reason, the outcome was the same. The settlement was in ruins, and many humans lay injured or dead. As she looked over the rubble, she clenched her fists. Humans did not bow easily. If the Lothraki believed they could break the Deathworlders' spirit, they were wrong. A distant rumble jolted Rhea from her thoughts. She saw lights in the sky. Lothraki ships, returning for another pass. A shiver ran through her. They were scanning the area, likely searching for survivors or hidden defenses. Rhea reached for her comm device. She knew she had to warn everyone who was still capable of fighting. Maybe they could hide, or maybe they could strike back. But no matter what, they would not surrender. Far below, in a makeshift medical tent, Dr. Elias Perez worked quickly to bandage a wounded colonist. He had dark circles under his eyes, evidence of many sleepless nights. Around him, the injured waited in rows, lying on stretchers or makeshift beds. Soft moans of pain mixed with the harsh hum of medical equipment. The air felt thick, heavy with the scent of blood and antiseptic. Yet Dr. Perez did not lose hope. He had treated survivors in worse conditions on Earth, and he knew human resilience was unmatched. If they could hold on just a bit longer, maybe they could recover and fight back. But the colony's defenses were almost gone. Lieutenant Corvus, a tall and quiet soldier, led the remaining security forces. They had only a few plasma rifles left, plus some homemade explosives. Corvus and his team hid behind a line of scorched vehicles, ready to make their last stand. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had an advantage the Lothraki did not understand: the spirit of Deathworlders. Corvus remembered Earth's toughest lessons. On Earth, humans learned to adapt to shifting weather, fight off predators, and create shelter under any conditions. Here on Theron, they had grown even stronger. They built farms on rocky soil, generated power from swirling windstorms, and mapped out safe zones in the most treacherous areas. They thrived where others would have perished. That unbreakable will was about to be tested again. The Lothraki ships descended lower, their engines roaring across the battered settlement. One ship hovered near the watchtower where Rhea stood. Through the dusty air, Rhea could see the alien pilot inside, scanning for life signs. She held her breath, wondering if she should move or keep still. She felt her heart thumping in her chest. Would they target her with lasers? Would they land and send in troops? She decided to take a risk. She aimed her comm device at the ship and pressed the broadcast button. All remaining units, this is Captain Carter, she said, her voice shaking only slightly. The Lothreki have returned. Everyone get to your positions. We stand our ground here. We do not run. Her words echoed across hidden speakers throughout the settlement. Corvus heard her call and looked at his small team. They nodded, determination in their eyes. Dr. Perez, still tending the wounded, paused for a moment. He whispered words of encouragement to a young patient, then stood to gather any who could still walk. Even the civilians, weary and afraid, began to stir. Some picked up tools to defend themselves. Others helped move the wounded to safer locations. The Lothreki ship's engines roared louder. Dust swept across the broken streets. Pieces of rubble clattered against walls. With a sharp hiss, the vessel landed a few hundred meters away. Its doors opened, revealing armored alien soldiers. They marched out in formation, weapons pointed forward. Their steps were precise, their eyes cold. Rhea watched them advance with a mix of fear and grim determination. She clicked her comm again. "Remember who we are," she said, her voice stronger now. "We are Deathworlders. Our homeworld was never easy, and this one is even harder. But we do not bow. We do not break." Down on the street, Corvus and his squad took aim from behind their makeshift barricades. Dr. Perez finished tying a bandage and helped his patient hide. Civilians gathered stones and metal scraps, anything that could become a weapon. A hush fell over the settlement. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then the first shot fired. It flashed across the rubble and blasted into a fallen pillar. A second shot came, then a third. Light flared, and stone fragments flew through the air. The humans braced themselves. The battle for Theron had begun, and with it came a new test of human spirit. What the Lothreki did not understand was that Deathworlders did not fight alone. They fought with every memory of survival, every lesson from their harsh past, and every ounce of hope for a future free from fear. In that moment, Rhea Carter stood taller than she ever had. She would not allow this new threat to end the human presence on Theron. Whatever happened next, the settlement's fall would not be the final chapter. It would only be the beginning of the rise. The first sparks of resistance. The air around the settlement seemed to tremble as the first Lothreki squad moved forward. Their armor was dark blue, shaped in sharp angles that reflected the eerie light from their dropship. In the distance, the damaged watchtower still stood, a lonely reminder of human resilience. Standing atop it, Captain Rhea Carter watched every step the aliens took. She felt both anxiety and resolve grow inside her. Below, Lieutenant Corvus and his squad huddled behind a half-collapsed wall. Dust and ash covered their clothes. Their eyes were fixed on the intruders. Each soldier checked their weapons, a mix of advanced plasma rifles and old ballistic guns. Some even held improvised grenades. They all shared the same thought. We may not win easily, but we will fight. A sudden shot whizzed past Corvus's ear. It slammed into the crumbling wall behind him. Chunks of stone exploded, raining debris onto his squad. One soldier let out a sharp cry, more from surprise than pain, and Corvus quickly raised his rifle. He waited for the right moment. The Lothreki seemed confident, marching in tight formation, their weapons aimed straight ahead. But Corvus knew a group that marched in such a straight line was vulnerable if you picked off the ones leading. Corvus gave a quick hand signal. Two of his soldiers, Hannah and Royce, moved carefully around the rubble to flank the enemy. The rest of the squad stayed in place to keep the Lothreki busy. The air crackled with energy blasts. Blue and orange beams crossed paths in the dusty streets. Each shot illuminated the chaos for a split second, revealing shattered buildings and the tense faces of defenders and invaders alike. Meanwhile, in the makeshift medical tent, Dr. Elias Perez was struggling to keep calm. More wounded poured in, and space was limited. Some of the injured clutched burnt arms or had deep cuts from flying debris. Dr. Perez's old friend, Maggie Chen, helped him set broken bones and stitch cuts, Their supplies were running dangerously low. Every so often, the ground shook from nearby explosions. The wounded whimpered or cried out in terror. Dr. Perez clenched his jaw. He was used to battlefield medicine. He had served in similar conditions on Earth, but this time felt different. The stakes were higher than ever. If the Lothreki destroyed the settlement, there would be no rescue ships coming. They were too far from any major human outpost to call for immediate reinforcements. Outside the tent, two desperate civilians pushed a cart filled with salvaged metal scraps. They were building crude barricades to protect the medical tent. Every man, woman, and child was doing something, whether carrying supplies, aiding the wounded, or standing guard with whatever weapon they could find. There was no time for fear. Survival demanded action. High above, on the watchtower, Rhea crouched low to avoid a stray energy bolt. She pressed her comm device again. "Corvus, do you read me?" she asked, her voice urgent but clear. A burst of static, then Corvus' strained voice. "I'm pinned down, Captain. We managed to flank one squad, but more are coming from the east. We need backup, or at least a distraction." Rhea looked at the horizon. She could see dust clouds forming, kicked up by approaching footsteps or vehicles. Something big was coming. She spotted a large, walker-like machine with spider-like legs, trudging slowly toward the settlement. A Lothreki war machine, no doubt. It was heavily armored, towering over the broken rooftops. Its metal limbs dug into the ground, sending vibrations through the settlement. If it reached them, their thin barricades would crumble like paper. "Understood, Lieutenant," Rhea replied into the comm. "Hold your position if you can. I'll try something." With that, she slid down the ladder of the watchtower and ran through the rubble. Her mind raced with possibilities. The colonists had rigged certain areas around the settlement with hidden explosives. Traps meant for wild predators, not advanced alien armies. Still, it might be enough to delay the walker. She just needed to guide it to the right spot. As she dashed through the fallen streets, she passed a group of frightened civilians. They huddled near a collapsed building, armed with only a few knives and metal rods. Rhea paused. "You all should head to the west side," she told them calmly. "Set up more barricades there. We need to protect the hospital tents. Hurry." The civilians nodded, relief evident on their faces. They had direction now, and direction meant hope. They scrambled away, leaving Rhea alone. Up ahead, she could see the silhouette of the walker pressing forward. She heard the mechanical grind of its joints. The Lothreki soldiers marched alongside it, scanning for any human ambushes. Rhea placed a hand on a scorched metal panel that hid a small control box. With trembling fingers, she pulled a lever and flipped two switches. She prayed the old wiring still worked. Back when they first settled on Theron, the colonists had set up an elaborate series of defensive traps in case of a large-scale beast attack. Now, those traps might be their only chance. A faint hum began beneath her feet. Lights on the control panel flickered. Then, a red indicator lit up. "It's armed," she thought. She grabbed her comm device again. "All units, stay clear of the main street near the water tower. I'm activating the auto-defense rig. Repeat, stay clear." Far away, Corvus heard the message and signaled his squad to duck behind a building's remains. They exchanged questioning looks, but they trusted their captain. If she said to stay clear, it meant something big was about to happen. The walker approached the main street. Step by step, it drew nearer to the buried explosives. The Lothreki soldiers, still moving in tight formation, checked every alley and every corner with their advanced sensors. Rhea prayed their scanners wouldn't detect the rigged traps beneath the ground. As the massive machine lifted its front leg, the panel in Rhea's hand flashed green. This was the moment. She pressed the final button. A thunderous explosion tore through the street. The ground heaved, and a shower of dust and debris erupted into the sky. For a split second, the walker teetered, sparks flying from its damaged leg. Chunks of metal and twisted circuitry scattered. The Lothreki squad dove for cover, some thrown aside by the force of the blast. Corvus saw a fireball shoot up from behind the building he was hiding in. A wave of hot air and dust followed. He and his squad shielded their faces, coughing as the shockwave passed. When he peered around the corner, he saw the walker listing to one side, its front leg nearly severed. A cheer erupted from his squad. At least they had managed to cripple the machine. But the fight was far from over. The Lothreki soldiers recovered quickly, returning fire with a fury. Energy beams streaked across the settlement, forcing Corvus and his squad back into cover. The spider-like walker was damaged but still operational, its remaining legs scraping the ground as it tried to steady itself. It let out a metallic groan, and sparks danced along its body. Nearby, Rhea crouched behind a broken wall, her heart pounding. She had expected the explosion to disable the walker completely, but it was stronger than she had imagined. Even half destroyed, it could wreak havoc. Still, she allowed herself a small smile. They had shown the Lothreki that humans were not easy prey. They had struck back, and they were just getting started. In the medical tent, Dr. Perez felt the ground tremble. He looked at Maggie, who nodded. "That must be the traps," she whispered. Around them, the wounded stirred in alarm, but Dr. Perez kept his voice steady as he comforted them. "That explosion is from our people. They are fighting back. We will survive this." Outside, the dust began to settle, revealing scorched ground where the main street once lay. Pieces of twisted metal were scattered everywhere. The Lothreki machine struggled to stand, sparks flying. Human soldiers regrouped, boosted by the small victory. Civilians peeked out from behind barricades. They had damaged the invaders. It was not a complete win, but it was a start. And in that beginning, the seeds of real resistance had taken root. A single act of defiance could inspire an entire colony. Now, the Lothreki would learn that when Deathworlders take a stand, they do not give up until they can no longer draw breath. The last stand on Theron. The settlement lay under a cloud of dust and smoke. Fires crackled among the rubble, and the air tasted bitter. Despite the destruction, a spark of hope still burned in the hearts of the Deathworlders. Captain Rhea Carter stood behind a broken wall, her face streaked with sweat and soot. The crippled Lothreki walker groaned in the center of the ruined street, sparks dancing along its jagged frame. Alien soldiers formed a defensive ring around their damaged machine, firing energy bolts at any human who dared to approach. Lieutenant Corvus crouched near Rhea, his chest heaving. "They have reinforcements on the way, Captain," he reported between ragged breaths. "We spotted another dropship above the southern ridge." Rhea wiped a bead of sweat from her brow. "We don't have the numbers to hold them off forever," she admitted, "but we can make sure they regret stepping onto Theron." Her gaze shifted to Dr. Elias Perez, who had joined them after leaving a few medics in charge at the makeshift hospital. He wore a grim expression, and his medical jacket was stained with dust and blood. "We have survivors and wounded who can't be moved," Dr. Perez said, his voice hoarse. "We must end this quickly, or they will be overrun." Rhea nodded, her mind racing. The remains of the settlement's old defense system had already dealt a powerful blow to the Lothreki, but the aliens were regrouping fast. Their advanced armor and weapons still gave them a fierce advantage. Yet the humans had something no sensor could measure: the will to survive against impossible odds. She looked around and noticed a small group of civilians gathering behind a half-collapsed building. They had hammers, pipes, and even a few working plasma rifles recovered from fallen Lothreki soldiers. Their faces showed a mix of terror and determination. Though they were not trained fighters, they stood ready to protect their home. Rhea raised her comm device. "Everyone who can fight, listen up," she said, her voice echoing through the battered settlement. "This is our final stand. We will not allow these invaders to destroy our colony. This is our planet, our home. We stand together and drive them out. Deathworlders do not surrender." A chorus of voices, some loud and others quiet, answered through the comm. Determined, unafraid. The humans took positions around the settlement's main street. Broken walls, toppled water tanks, and abandoned vehicles served as cover. Corvus led a small squad behind the walker, while Rhea and Dr. Perez prepared to face the soldiers at the front. The Lothreki advanced with renewed purpose, their ranks tightening around the wounded walker. Bolts of energy seared through the air, setting debris aflame. Smoke and sparks created a flickering strobe effect, making the scene look like a storm of light and ash. Corvus waited for Rhea's signal. At the same time, his teammate Hannah clutched a makeshift grenade. She had scavenged the explosive from a damaged Lothreki weapon. A countdown timer blinked on its side. They only had one shot at this. Rhea gave the signal with a sharp gesture. At once, the hidden human fighters erupted from cover, unleashing a volley of fire. Plasma beams and bullet rounds struck the alien formation from all sides. The Lothreki scrambled to respond. Their armor absorbed many hits, but the sudden, coordinated attack left them momentarily off balance. Dr. Perez fired a plasma pistol for the first time in his life. His hand shook, but he forced himself to stay focused. The blast struck a Lothreki soldier square in the chest, knocking it to the ground. Nearby, a civilian swung a metal rod at another alien, aiming for the unprotected joint in its armor. The Lothreki staggered, giving another colonist time to tackle it to the ground. Behind the walker, Corvus and Hannah moved swiftly. Shots pinged off the walker's metal legs. Hannah spotted a gap in the machine's armor, a twisted section created by the explosion earlier. She pressed the timer on the makeshift grenade. Its green display lit up. She had only seconds. "Cover me," she shouted to Corvus. Corvus leaped up, firing wildly at the Lothreki soldiers on the walker's flank. The aliens fired back, but their aim was off in the confusion. Hannah sprinted forward, tossed the grenade into the gap, and dove behind a shattered column. A blinding flash lit the street. The walker's damaged leg buckled completely. The machine collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending up a shockwave of dust. Shattered metal and flaming debris flew in all directions. One of the walker's cannons exploded, taking out several Lothreki soldiers. A roar went up from the human defenders. Despite the chaos, the remaining aliens did not retreat. Reinforcements from the second dropship arrived, descending from the smoke-filled sky. Their armor glistened under the swirling debris. More Lothreki lined up, forming ranks with practiced discipline. They stepped over the wreckage of their war machine without hesitation. "We're not finished," Corvus warned through the comm. "There are more of them now." Rhea's throat tightened. She saw the new wave of Lothreki and knew the human defenders were exhausted. Ammunition was running low, and many had already taken injuries. If the Lothreki pushed hard, they could crush the humans. She felt a surge of dread, but also something stronger, the unbreakable resolve to stand her ground. "Do we have any other traps?" Dr. Perez asked, panting. Rhea shook her head. "We used them all. We have to hold with what we have." From the edge of the battle, a mighty gust of wind swept the streets. It carried sand and grit from Theron's harsh desert. The swirling dust thickened, becoming a storm that tore through the remains of the settlement. It was as if the planet itself was rising to defend its people. Visibility dropped, and the Lothreki lines grew scattered, struggling to see through the sudden sandstorm. Rhea seized the opportunity. "Now," she shouted. "Advance. Push them back." The humans surged forward, using the storm as cover. Energy blasts from the Lothreki went wild, many sizzling harmlessly into the air. Civilians with melee weapons rushed the confused aliens. Soldiers like Corvus fired methodically, picking targets they could see through the dust. Dr. Perez, breathing hard, treated each gap in the fighting as a chance to drag a wounded comrade to safety. The swirling sand bit at Rhea's skin, but she pressed on. She fired her rifle at two Lothreki who stumbled in the haze. They fell, and she moved closer. Everywhere, humans fought with a desperate fury. The Lothreki, unable to coordinate in the blinding storm, retreated step by step. some climbing into dropships to avoid being overwhelmed. In a final burst of wind and sand, the alien lines broke. The second dropship, struggling to maintain steady flight in the storm, lifted off with the remaining Lothraki on board. They left the wreckage of the first ship, the Walker, and dozens of their fallen. The dust storm raged on, forcing them higher into the sky. Soon, they vanished from view, disappearing into Theron's turbulent atmosphere. A ragged cheer rose among the humans. Some collapsed to the ground in relief. Others helped the wounded stand. The sandstorm began to calm, revealing the battered settlement, still standing, but forever scared. Captain Rhea Carter lowered her weapon, heart pounding. Dr. Perez knelt to check on a collapsed fighter. The colonist was breathing, just exhausted. Corvus stood nearby, holding his rifle with trembling hands. He stared at the retreating dropship, expression fierce. "They'll be back," he said quietly. Rhea nodded, a solemn understanding passing between them. "Then we'll be ready," she replied. "We prove that we do not break when threatened. Let them come. Deathworlders stand as long as we can breathe." The survivors gathered in the main street, under the shadow of the broken walker. The ground was littered with debris, but in that rubble lay the proof that humans had faced a technologically superior force and fought it off. The cost was high, but they were still here. Slowly, the settlement began to stir with renewed hope. People hugged each other, tears mixing with dust. The wounded were carried to Dr. Perez's makeshift hospital, and the unhurt began searching for food and water supplies that could be salvaged. The final rays of the setting sun broke through the smoky sky, casting long shadows across the battlefield. In that quiet moment after the storm, Captain Rhea Carter surveyed the survivors. Their spirits, though tested, were unbroken. No matter what the Lothraki thought, humans from Earth were always ready to take a stand. On a harsh death world like Theron, resilience was not just a trait, it was life itself. She raised her head to the darkening sky, as if addressing both the fading sunlight and any unseen threat. "We are Deathworlders," she said softly, but with unwavering conviction. "When we stand together, no force can break us." The wind carried her words through the settlement, across the fallen rubble, and up into the atmosphere. And though the scars of battle remained, a new chapter was about to begin. A chapter where the Deathworlders of Theron had proven that they would never bow, no matter how powerful the enemy.